You are looking at the deadliest economic cliff on the planet. Step 1 meter north, and you are in an economy worth $28 trillion. Step 1 meter south, and your earning power instantly drops by 85%. Common sense says that sharing a border with a rich country should make you rich. But for Mexico, proximity to the United States hasn't been a ladder, it has been a trap. Why? The answer isn't what you think. It's not just cartels, it's not just corruption. Those are symptoms. The real reason Mexico is poor is due to a specific economic mechanism designed in the year 1521, a mechanism that turned this country into a prison of extraction. And the twist? The United States isn't fixing the problem. By design, it might actually be keeping it alive. Let's look at the cash flow. Every single day, well over $150 million in remittances flows across this border, mostly from the United States into Mexico, not the other way around. In remittances alone, Mexican workers sent home about $63 billion in 2023, making it one of Mexico's largest sources of foreign income. Here's the uncomfortable question. How is it possible that a country sharing a 3,145-kilometer border with the world's largest economy has a GDP per capita roughly 6 times smaller? The answer isn't what you think, and it has nothing to do with work ethic. In the next 12 minutes, you're going to understand something that economists, politicians, and business leaders have debated for over a century. Why does proximity to wealth not create wealth? We're going to break this down into 3 parts. First, the historical trap that locked Mexico into a specific economic pattern centuries before the United States even existed. Second, the policies, both Mexican and American, that turned a neighbor into a workshop rather than a true partner. And third, the geographic curse hiding in plain sight that makes Mexico's situation unusual by global standards. I've pulled data from the World Bank, the IMF, Mexico's own statistics agency, and research from Nobel Prize-winning economists. By the end of this video, you'll see your own country's economy differently. Part 1. The historical trap. Let's start with what most people believe. A common narrative you hear is that Mexico is poor because of corruption, drug cartels, and bad government decisions. And while those factors matter, many economists see them as symptoms, not the underlying disease. The real story, in economic terms, begins in 1521. When Hernan Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, he didn't establish a colony designed to build broad-based wealth in Mexico. He established an extraction economy. Spain's colonial model in New Spain relied heavily on encomienda-style systems and large estates that extracted indigenous labor and resources, with profits flowing back to Madrid. Here's the key difference people often point to. In much of British North America, settlers were more commonly given land grants and built farms, businesses, and communities with the intention of staying, though these systems were still deeply exploitative toward enslaved people and indigenous nations. In New Spain, what we now call Mexico institutions like encomienda and later large haciendas concentrated land and power in the hands of a small elite. Between 1,500 and 1,800, Spanish America, including what is now Mexico, produced an estimated 185,000 tons of silver, often cited as around 80% of the world's output at the time. This wasn't investment, it was drainage. Economists Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, in their landmark book Why Nations Fail, call these extractive institutions rules of the game, designed to concentrate wealth and power rather than spread them. Extractive institutions don't disappear when colonial powers leave, they get inherited. When Mexico gained independence in 1821, it didn't inherit diversified industries or strong, inclusive political institutions. It inherited a mining economy, a rigid class system, and highly concentrated land ownership. By the late 19th and early 20th century, around 1% of landowners controlled almost all arable land, often cited at about 97%, a pattern rooted in that colonial past. Compare that to the United States, a country where, relative to Mexico, land among white settlers was more broadly distributed, merchant classes were building capital, And political institutions were more oriented, though very imperfectly, toward participation rather than pure extraction. The wealth gap between the US and Mexico is not only a 20th century story. Many historians argue that its roots go back to institutions formed centuries earlier. Part 2. The mechanism, oil debt and maquiladores. Now, let's fast forward to the 20th century, because here's where it gets interesting. Mexico actually tried to break free from this trap multiple times, and each time a specific mechanism pulled it back. In 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas made a bold move. He nationalized Mexico's oil industry, creating Pemex, one of the world's largest state oil companies. The goal was simple: keep Mexican resources generating Mexican wealth. For a while, it worked. By around 1980, oil accounted for roughly 3/4 of Mexico's export revenue. The country was booming, banks were lending, the future looked bright. Then came 1982. Global oil prices collapsed. Mexico had borrowed heavily against future oil revenues. When the money stopped flowing, Mexico defaulted on roughly $80 billion in foreign debt, the first domino in what became Latin America's lost decade. To restructure that debt, Mexico accepted IMF WAYO-backed structural adjustment programs, privatization, deregulation, and opening markets to foreign capital. Economists still argue over the long-term impact, but the measurable result was this. From the 1980s onward, Mexico's manufacturing sector transformed, with the country increasingly becoming an assembly platform for global supply chains, especially along the US border. Enter the maquiladoras, foreign-owned factories along the US border, where components arrive from Asia or the US, get assembled by Mexican workers, and shipped directly to American consumers. By 2023, Mexico became the United States' largest goods trading partner, with around $800 billion in total annual trade. That sounds like success. But here's the catch. Harvard economist Danny Roderick points out that Mexico has had more free trade agreements than almost any country in the world, and yet its growth has been disappointing. Trade integration alone didn't deliver an East Asian-style growth miracle. Why? Because assembly isn't innovation. Recent data show Mexican manufacturing workers earn only a fraction of what US manufacturing workers do, roughly 1/5 to 1/6 as much in hourly compensation. The intellectual property, the design, the branding, the high-margin work that largely stays north of the border. Mexico captures much of the wage-based assembly work, while a large share of high-margin profits tends to stay with firms based in the United States. And there's one more factor that almost nobody talks about. According to Mexico's statistics agency, INEGI, around 55–56% of Mexico's workforce operates in the informal economy. That usually means no formal social security, unstable contracts, and limited access to formal credit. It's hard to build a modern tax base and welfare state when more than half your workers are informal. Part 3, the geographic curse. Now, here's the part that might surprise you. We've talked history, we've talked policy. But there's a third factor hiding in plain sight, one that neither government can easily change. Look at this map. Mexico isn't flat. Two massive mountain ranges, the Sierra Madre Oriental and the Sierra Madre Occidental, run roughly parallel along each coast, with a high central plateau wedged between them. That makes the country beautiful and expensive to connect. Building roads, rail, and pipelines in mountainous terrain can cost several times more often reported as 2 to 5 times than in flat regions. While the United States built a transcontinental railroad across relatively favorable terrain in the 19th century, Mexico's geography made equivalent connectivity far more costly and complicated until modern engineering. Even today, Mexico has only about 18,000 kilometers of rail, compared to roughly 150,000 kilometers in the United States. And much of Mexico's network is single track, meaning trains often can't move freely in both directions at once. Here's a concrete example. In some periods, shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles has actually been cheaper than trucking that same container from Los Angeles to Mexico City. Long-distance ocean freight can be surprisingly cheap compared to moving goods over mountains and congested roads. But geography creates another problem with darker implications. Those same mountains and remote regions that complicate commerce can create ideal hiding spots for illicit activity. Some UN and academic estimates suggest Mexican cartels may generate tens of billions of dollars annually from drug trafficking, figures that, if accurate, would be comparable in scale to major legal sectors like tourism, though such estimates are highly uncertain. Cartels don't just smuggle drugs. In some regions, criminal groups exert significant influence over local authorities and businesses, effectively creating pockets of de facto control. They infiltrate logistics companies, extort firms, and build parallel governance structures in areas the federal state struggles to reach. The World Bank's now discontinued Ease of Doing Business Index ranked Mexico 60th globally in 2020. Not terrible on paper, but that national level score hides the reality that the business environment in some states is heavily constrained by violence and extortion. One estimate by economist Viridiana Rios Contreras suggests that violence could cost Mexico on the order of 4 or 5% of GDP annually, depending on the methodology used, money that could otherwise fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So when we ask why is Mexico still so much poorer than its neighbor despite sharing a border with the world's largest economy, geography isn't just about trade routes. It's about governability itself. Let's step back and see the full picture. First, the historical trap. Centuries of extractive colonial institutions created patterns of inequality and weak governance that persisted long after independence, including extreme land concentration by the late 19th and early 20th century. Second, the modern mechanism. After the oil boom and the 1982 debt crisis, structural adjustment and trade liberalization pushed Mexico into an export-held model where it increasingly specializes in assembly. The country captures wages in low-margin segments, while much of the high-value design and intellectual property income remains elsewhere, at the same time as more than half the workforce remains in the informal economy. Third, the geographic curse. Mountains and difficult terrain raise infrastructure costs, limit connectivity, and create spaces where the state's reach is weaker and criminal organizations can thrive, imposing economic costs measured in several percentage points of GDP. Here's the thought that stays with me. Around 1,980, Mexico's GDP per capita in current dollars was slightly higher than South Korea's. Today, South Korea's income per person is above $30,000, while Mexico's is in the mid-teens, showing how two countries with similar starting points can end up on radically different paths. Geography isn't destiny, but escaping it and escaping history requires something Mexico hasn't fully achieved yet: institutions strong enough to overcome the historical gravity pulling it backward. If this video changed how you think about borders and economics, hit subscribe. We're doing a deep dive on Brazil next week, a country with vast natural resources that still struggles to break into the very top tier of rich economies. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, do you think Mexico's situation will improve as manufacturing shifts away from China and toward North America? Or is it trapped in middle income status for the foreseeable future? The best comments get featured in our next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.